A new Godzilla movie just released, and if you're anything like me, that being you live in the wrong part of the world, then 2 new Godzilla movies just released. I figured this is a good occasion to give myself a challenge and to make a sculpture with a lot of details, and the new pink Godzilla caught my eye, so he's my muse for this one. First, I need an armature with the correct proportions, but I don't have a printer, so I used more primitive solutions and traced it on paper from my tablet. Once I had my correctly scaled tracing, I tried my best to get the armature wire to that exact same scale, and you'll see in about a minute how accurate it turned out. With some aluminum foil and masking tape, I shaped out Godzilla's body so he can at least stand on his 2 feet and tail, and then moved on to bulking him out with some Super Sculpey. While doing this, I noticed that he was a bit too wide around his hips, so... Now that he's 100% proportionally correct, I went on to build the rest of his body. While doing this, I also noticed that I was running out of clay, so naturally I gave Godzilla neck surgery to get extra clay from there. Most of his body was done, so I decided to start shaping up his head, which did start off looking like a more classic Godzilla, but I eventually found my way back to what I was going for, I promise. To make his hands, I cut the individual fingers in blobs of clay and roughly shaped them out, and after attaching them to his arms, I gave him thumbs as well, then bulked and shaped out his hands. Then onto his feet. After giving him some sharp toes, I made it more clear that those are in fact his claws and gave them a rougher texture. I also decided to give him the gift of sight, which helped me shape his face further so that he finally starts to look more like legendary Godzilla and less like a boring dinosaur. For his back spines, I used some thin wire wrapped in clay for the larger ones and stuck them in his back and blended them in. As they got smaller towards his head, he also got a spiky mohawk, which I made by blending in a line of clay and then cutting out bits of it so they look like individual spikes. He also seems to have a couple smaller mohawks on the sides of his head, which I'm pretty sure qualifies them as sideburns. Once his general shape was finished, I then began the most time-consuming part of this whole thing, and that is texturing his body. The front of his legs and toes have these scaly plates that I made by cutting jagged lines along the length of them. And for the back of his tail, I added individual lines of clay and blended them in on one side so there's more noticeable difference in height between them, up towards the tip of his tail where I just scored them in. Jumping to his head again, I added some lines to the membrane in his mouth, gave him some wrinkles on his face, and spiked up his eyebrow ridge. After which, I used my ball stylus to make the ridges on the side of his neck and then continued on his back with the mixture of spikes, scales, and cracks. Once that was done, I added details to his dorsal spines, sharpening them up a bit and also adding grooves with my ball stylus. The lead character designer for the movie mentioned that this form of Godzilla was inspired by Goku's Kaioken power-up, so I did find myself calling him Kaioken Godzilla every now and then. For this sculpture, I also tried making one of these texture rollers for scales, and it's not perfect, but overall it got the results I needed just to make him as rough and uneven as possible across his whole body. Then his arms get some plates and spiky scales of their own, after which I move on to make his chest armor. I traced out the basic shapes of the plating, on which then I made deeper grooves and textured each piece so they look like rocky bone plates. Finally, after baking him, I used a file to give him a pedicure and manicure combo, along with sharpening his dorsal spines, making him unsafe for kids, but especially unsafe for me. And now that we're done with the sculpting, we move on to painting. First off, I'll take him away for a bit, just to bring him back all primed up in white and ready for some color. I mixed up these three paints for his base color, with no quantities in mind for each of them, so his scale tone will be a variation between greenish and purplish. But since he's a radioactive lizard, you can blame the varied colors in that instead of my color mixing skills. And speaking of radioactive, I used the glow-in-the-dark pink for his spines, which I can only hope will look cool in the final shots of the video. Then dry brushed them with the same pink, but mixed with a bit of white paint. The inside of his mouth gets a fleshy pink color, and his teeth get a dirty white teeth color. Then I went on dry brush the rest of his body with different tones, so all that texturing I spent my time on actually mattered in the end. Starting with the mustard yellow for the armored plates on his chest and base of his tail. Moss green for the underside of his tail, and for the rest of his scales I mixed just a bit of white with the 3-color base coat that I made for him, which worked better than expected with all the cracks, scales, and spikes that I gave him. Finished everything off by painting his nails with an off-white of varying shades, and we are done. I hope you enjoyed the sculpting process. I'm still getting used to the whole voiceover thing, and I hope I can get better in time, but thank you for watching, and here's some shots I took of the final sculpture. Enjoy.